This week is about celebrating what it means to be for the people. Vice President Harris has chosen in Tim Walz a running mate who has a coach, a congressman, a sergeant, a veteran, a governor, has a record of fighting for the middle class. And I'm excited that we're kicking off our campaign by celebrating just how much Joe Biden got done at home and abroad.
The Democratic National Convention kicks off today in Chicago, where history will be made. For the first time, a woman of color will officially be nominated as the party's presidential candidate. It's been a short road to this moment, all starting just a little over 4 weeks ago when President Biden announced he would exit the race. Of course, all eyes will be on Biden tonight as the president makes his primetime speech at the convention, his 13th DNC, where he will pass the torch to Vice President Harris. It will certainly be a tightrope walk for Biden. The president is looking to take credit for his accomplishments and tout all that he has done during his 4 years in office, but at the same time find just the right buffer between him and Vice President Harris, not to heavily tie the president hopeful to his administration. Joining me now is the Hill's national political reporter, Julia Manchester, who is on the ground there in Chicago. Julia, give us a look ahead about tonight. What can we expect to hear from President Biden as the convention kicks off?
Hey, Margaret. Well, you're absolutely right. This is all about passing the torch tonight. This is about Joe Biden cementing his legacy as president for the first 4 years of his administration and passing that torch to ensure that Kamala Harris essentially carries his legacy on into, a potential Harris administration and making sure that she continues to really finish the job. Remember, Biden and Harris obviously were on the same ticket in 2020. They've had this administration together. So in a way, Kamala Harris is running on Joe Biden's record. Now, she'll want to make some changes. She'll want to do things her way. But Joe Biden is going to be making the case to the American voters about what his administration was like, his accomplishments. Democrats like to say that his administration was one of the most productive in, decades, really, out of many administrations, talking about massive pieces of legislation that have been passed, such as the Build Back Better plan, the infrastructure legislation, which was bipartisan. So expect him to talk about that, to talk about his, legacy in politics and really talk about the next generation and what he says are his hopes for that new generation of leadership within the Democratic Party.
A bit of a handoff speech, but also a time to sell his accomplishments. Now, President Biden will only be at the convention tonight, heading on vacation after that. And, Democrats, is this a sign of any rising tension between the president and top Democrats after he was essentially forced to withdraw from the election?
I don't think so. This is essentially Biden passing the torch. I mean, this is Kamala Harris's convention, and this is a chance for her to be able to introduce herself to the American people. She's been vice president. She was obviously a senator from California, so she has that, national profile, but she's not as perhaps well known to many Americans as someone like Donald Trump is. So they want to give her the chance to tell her own story and to make this really about her and also about her running mate, Tim Walz, and to showcase other Democrats who are up for re-election and really talk about the Democratic record. In addition to President Biden speaking, you also have other major Democratic names, speaking to not only tonight, but also throughout the week. Hillary Clinton, the former First Lady and Secretary of State, former President Bill Clinton, Barack and Michelle Obama, obviously very popular figures, not only within the Democratic Party, but in American politics. So, Biden leaving, I think, is a way to sort of symbolically pass the torch and say, look, the spotlight should be on Kamala Harris. She is at the top of the ticket at the end of the day.
Julia, you mentioned some of the big political heavyweights taking to the stage. What are some other big moments to watch for?
I think obviously you have these political heavyweights taking to the stage. You also have some rising stars at this convention, potential governors who would be seen as contenders down the line for presidential races. But one thing we are watching for is to see how protests, in particular pro-Palestinian protests, impact this election. They've been happening outside of the perimeter here in Chicago, but I think there's a real question as to where pro-Palestinian protests, how they impact this convention? Will they essentially, will there be any hecklers inside? Will this get in the way of Kamala Harris and, her message? We know that this issue of support for Israel and support for the Palestinian people has been one that has certainly divided the Democratic Party. So does this mean the party is divided going forward? We don't know, but we'll definitely be watching for that to see if these protests have a negative or positive impact on this convention.
Julia, we know you just landed in Chicago a short time ago. What is the energy on the ground like there heading into this big week?
I think there's a lot of energy. I think a lot of Democrats are so excited, obviously, to be here for this convention. It's hard to imagine just a month ago, this convention was going to be totally different. This was going to be Joe Biden's convention. Now it's Kamala Harris's convention. And just a month ago, I think there was a lot of anxiety and, quite frankly, despair among Democrats. So I think, they're feeling quite jubilant, quite energized, quite excited to be here in Chicago. Obviously, Chicago, a big Democratic city, a big union city, very emblematic of that blue wall. So there's definitely excitement there, but also some anxiety. I talked about those protests. We don't know how these protests are going to impact the election, if it's going to have a negative impact or if it will be seen as maybe, more voices in the Democratic fold making their voices heard. So definitely some excitement sprinkled in with some, potential anxiety as to what's to come with this potential divide within the party.
Certainly. Now, Harris is heading into the convention with a major jump in polling. The latest shows the vice president is now leading Trump 3 points nationally. Despite this, Harris still says she sees herself as the underdog in the race. What should we make of her surge in the polls? Is this just a reflection of a honeymoon phase with voters, or has something fundamentally changed with her at the top of the ticket instead of Biden?
I think there's a few things at play. First of all, I think there absolutely is a honeymoon phase. She is seen as someone who is definitely off to a very positive start. She's gotten a lot of positive coverage. She's run a very good messaging campaign. We see that a lot of young voters in particular are excited about her. We're seeing that played out in social media. So that's, I think, resonating in the polls, that excitement. But we normally see with, in the run up to conventions, maybe during conventions, it's definitely a bit of a spike in the polls for the candidate. We saw that Donald Trump and Republicans got that just a few weeks ago in Milwaukee. So I think you're seeing that here with Harris. You're also seeing Democrats coming home in the polls. They feel energized. They feel excited. It's certainly a mood change from where they were before. But, I think there could be something bigger at play here, though. You're seeing Kamala Harris close the gap in key regions of the country, such as here in the Midwest. You're also seeing her do that in the Sun Belt in states like North Carolina and Georgia, where just a month ago, Democrats were feeling pretty negatively about their chances. So there is definitely a curiosity about Kamala Harris. That being said, though, we know that things can change rapidly in elections, and we see that polls tend to narrow definitely after Labor Day. So, this could be a honeymoon phase. I think the Harris campaign is expected for things to tighten, for the news cycle as fickle as it can be. They're trying to prepare for any curveballs thrown at them. In politics, we have this, the saying, it's called an October surprise, these surprise events that happen, in October before the election. We've had so many surprises already in June and July, so who knows what's yet to come between now and November.
Certainly been busy. Another boost Harris is seeing is in her favorability rating among Americans. A new survey from the Associated Press, NORC, shows that 48% now have a very or somewhat favorable view of Harris. Is Harris's messaging really sticking heading into November? And is it a sign that her campaign has done a solid job defining the presidential candidate to voters?
I think right now they're still forming that message. She released her economic plan just last week in North Carolina, and she's starting to roll out these policy proposals. And, look, she is running on Joe Biden's record in many ways, but she's putting her own spin, her own ideas on a lot of these policies. So she is still in many ways defining herself. And I think what you're going to see in this room this week, specifically on Thursday night, is, her defining herself, talking about her biographical history, her childhood, formative years, etc. But I think her campaign has certainly done a good job with messaging so far, particularly tapping into that young vote that we talk about that's so important. Young voters seem to feel more energized than in past elections, and we're seeing that play out in spaces like social media. And I talk about that young vote, but we're also seeing this enthusiasm seen in the polls with some older voters as well, and with women voters in general, African American voters. They all seem to feel that Harris right now has, is the person with momentum, and they feel positively about her. But like I said, things tend to tighten after Labor Day, and she is still a very relatively new candidate. So she'll work to really cement her definition of herself, if you will, this week at the DNC. But, her campaign's still going to have to contend with Republicans working to redefine her in a negative light.
A lot to watch this week out of Chicago. The Hill's Julia Manchester, thank you.
Thanks, Margaret.
Former President Donald Trump and his VP pick, J.D. Vance, are aiming to offer a forceful response to Democrats gathering in Chicago this week. The two are hitting the road in several critical swing states, reaching out to voters across the country. Trump is returning to Pennsylvania today, where he begins the battleground state blitz. It will be Trump's 10th visit to the state since announcing his 2024 bid. The former president is supposed to focus his remarks on the economy, but the big question remains, can he stay on message as the Trump campaign hopes to bring Harris's honeymoon period to an end? Here to discuss, the Hill's Brett Samuels. Brett, the Trump campaign is doing its best to counter-program the DNC. Trump kicking off a tour of battleground states. He's also having surrogates hold news conferences in Chicago during the convention. Does this strategy have a chance of working? What issues is the Trump campaign going to focus on as part of their counter-programming?
Yeah, the big question of whether it works, I think depends on how the former president is able to stay on message, whether he's able to stay on message, or whether they end up cutting through the sort of coverage of the DNC because of something controversial that Trump says, which we've seen him do in some of his recent appearances. But the hope for the Trump campaign is that they will spend the next 5 days, the rest of the week, essentially offering counter programming to the DNC by visiting key battleground states that are going to decide the election in November, and ideally focusing on the issues that Republicans feel like they have a strong argument on. So we'll see. As you mentioned, former President Trump will be in Pennsylvania talking about the economy. He's supposed to visit Detroit, the Detroit area in Michigan to talk about crime. He'll head to Arizona to speak near the border about immigration. He'll be in North Carolina talking about national security. So these are the issues that the Trump campaign really feels like they have on their side. And the question is whether the former president himself can stay on that message and really hammer home what Republicans feel like is a winning formula for them in November.
Trump continues to go off message with personal attacks aimed at Harris, having this to say at a rally in Pennsylvania over the weekend.
But I say that I am much better looking than her. I think I'm much better. Much better. I'm a better looking person than Kamala.
Top Republicans are really urging him to stop the insults and focus on policy differences. This comes as polls continue to move in Harris's favor. Are there any signs Trump will take his allies' advice and talk policy, or is Trump going to just continue to be Trump that we're getting right now?
Yeah, after about 8 years of Trump campaigning, it's just kind of apparent, I think, that he is who he is. And this is what you get with him is, on the one hand, he excites a lot of his supporters. He motivates this huge base of voters. But on the other hand, you're going to have to put up with sort of, asides like that where he goes off topic and he makes news on things that Republicans shake their heads at and roll their eyes at, where he gets really personal and sort of goes, what would traditionally be thought of as a bit out of bounds and attacking his opponent. Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, who's a really close Trump ally, said over the weekend that he thinks that Trump could win on the issues in November, but that maybe Trump the showman and Trump the provocateur might not win in November. And I think those comments you saw over the weekend in Pennsylvania, that's sort of a perfect example of why Republicans are, essentially begging Trump, in public, going on TV and really pleading with him to focus on policy, because instead of talking about policy, everyone is talking about these very personal attacks against Vice President Harris. And that's not really a winning message for Republicans. It's not really a winning message for former President Trump as he seeks to kind of stop the momentum from the Harris campaign.
So the long-awaited report on President Biden's impeachment was released by House Republicans today, accusing him of corruption and allowing his family to profit from his time in office. No smoking guns here, and Biden is now a lame-duck president. So is this report the end of House Republicans' investigations into Biden, or is there more planned?
Yeah, it certainly seems like this is sort of the end of the road, given, as you said, President Biden will be out of office in a little under 6 months. There doesn't seem to be much appetite among Republicans to actually vote on some kind of impeachment against President Biden. This report, as you mentioned, does not really have much of a smoking gun. It's sort of rehashing a lot of what we've already heard, which is Republicans believe that President Biden and his family essentially profited from Biden's place in government. But at the same time, testimony from the president's brother, from his son, Hunter Biden, sort of undercut those claims. There was no evidence that Biden ever changed policy to benefit his family or because of his family's business interests with Ukraine or China. So it's sort of a big deal that this report is out, but in another way, it sort of, I think, signals that this is, basically the end of the road. There's just not much interest, much appetite among Republicans to really kind of push this through and actually take a vote on this. So I would be surprised if we see much of a push behind this report. And instead, I think it's more likely we see Republicans pivot to attacking Vice President Harris and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who's on the ticket in November.
The Republican primary for Florida's 1st congressional district is shaping up to be a rematch between Congressman Matt Gaetz and the man he toppled, former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Well, no, McCarthy isn't on the ballot, but a political committee he controls has spent about $3 million attacking Gaetz and promoting his opponent, former Navy pilot Aaron Dimmock. How competitive is this contest in Florida, and does McCarthy and his allies have any chance of defeating Gaetz?
Yeah, certainly. This is sort of the big, I think, climax of this fight that we've seen playing out for the better part of the last year and a half between Kevin McCarthy and Matt Gaetz, where obviously Matt Gaetz was a big hurdle for Kevin McCarthy in securing the gavel to become speaker. And then Gaetz was a key figure in toppling McCarthy as speaker and ousting him. And the two have continued to trade really personal attacks in the months since then. So certainly there's a very personal element to this, but the question of whether it's going to be successful for Kevin McCarthy, who has so far really struggled to topple any of the folks who he has tried to take out in a primary who voted to oust him as speaker. He hasn't been successful in that regard. I'd be surprised if he's successful with Matt Gaetz. Certainly Matt Gaetz is no stranger to controversy. Each time he's run for re-election, there's been sort of this flood of negative press, this push to oust him over his conduct in Congress, over these allegations about his ethics behavior. So, Matt Gaetz is no stranger to these kinds of challenges and this kind of opposition. But, the question is whether this time will be different because Kevin McCarthy is putting a lot of time and money and resources behind this effort.
Democrats say the RFK Jr. campaign is showing signs of desperation as he tries to keep his third-party presidential campaign afloat. The latest sign, he attempted to meet with the Harris team for a possible job in her administration in exchange for his endorsement. Does he have any chance of playing spoiler in this election at this point? What's the state of his campaign?
Yeah, I think the fact that RFK Jr. is reaching out to the Harris campaign to see about some kind of job is really reflective of his standing in the presidential race, which is that it's really, really diminished in the last few months, especially. There was a time when polling showed RFK Jr. in double digits and that he could actually play a really significant role, maybe not as a victorious candidate, but certainly as a spoiler candidate in some key swing states. But just in the last couple of months, we've had RFK Jr. on the phone with former President Trump talking about a potential job in a Trump administration should Trump win. We've had him, reaching out to the Harris campaign to see about a possible job in her administration should she win. Now, RFK Jr. has sort of pushed back on this, said that he's in it to defeat these candidates and that they're not good for the country. But it's hard to ignore the fact that I think, he's looking out for himself. He's looking out for what he could do after this election or what he might be able to get in return for some kind of endorsement. And I think that's reflective of the fact that he just doesn't have much momentum or much traction at this point as the race really kind of narrows in on Trump and Harris.
Former Congressman George Santos is expected to plead guilty in his fraud case during a hearing in federal court on Long Island today. Of course, he could change his mind at any point, but the controversial Santos has been defiant since being charged. What could a plea deal mean for him? What can we expect?
Yeah, to your point, George Santos had really sort of professed his innocence for as long as these charges have been brought against him. So the fact that he's reversed course, I think, is a sign that, we were getting down to the nitty gritty here, getting down to the wire. And, if he went to trial, if he were convicted on these charges, they would bring with them a minimum amount of prison time. So, he was looking at jail time should he be convicted. So this plea deal could help him avoid going to prison. But certainly, we shall see if he goes through with this deal, but any plea would, of course, mean that he's admitting guilt when it comes to some of these charges around misleading donors, around inflating campaign finance reports. And these charges have been following him for months, or really since he got to the House after the 2022 midterm elections. So certainly one to watch, but it's just another example of sort of the George Santos saga just continuing and being something that Washington, D.C. can't quite shake.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you, as always, The Hill's Brett Samuels.
Thank you.
A breakthrough in ceasefire negotiations. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying Monday that Israel has accepted a U.S. proposal to secure the release of the remaining hostages and bring the war in Gaza to a halt. This proposal is based on a UN-backed proposal the Biden administration rolled out in May of this year. Secretary Blinken is now urging Hamas to accept the deal as well.
It's the single best way not only to get the hostages home, to ease the suffering of people in Gaza, is also the best way to make sure that conflict doesn't spread, and then open prospects for trying to build a more enduring peace and security for everyone.
It comes after Blinken warned Monday that this may be the best and last chance for the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas mediators, including Secretary Blinken will meet again this week in Cairo to hear Hamas's response and potentially finalize the details. U.S.-backed forces were deployed to take control of Haiti back from violent street gangs is struggling to complete their mission. The U.S.-backed and Kenyan-led coalition of 400 troops was deployed to the island nation nearly 2 months ago with the goal of restoring order. So far, the troops have not been able to reach the capital city of Port-au-Prince, and the only 2 major clashes have been resulted in setbacks. Experts say the coalition will need more than just more money and more officers to solve the gang violence in the country. Haiti has been struggling with gang violence since the assassination of the president in 2021. The COVID-19 pandemic may be over, but the disease isn't gone. Infections have surged across the country this summer, and it shows no signs of slowing. The wave is due in large part to new mutations and variants. The CDC no longer tracks individual infection numbers, but experts say it could be the biggest summer wave yet. So far, the variants have proven to cause more serious illness, and the vaccines are still effective. Television talk show host Phil Donahue died Sunday at his home in New York. Donahue spent nearly 30 years as the host of The Phil Donahue Show, known for tackling tough topics and speaking with controversial guests. He was the first talk show host to invite audiences to question his guests and was the first host to open telephone lines to viewers at home. With roughly over 7,000 episodes, Donahue's show won a total of 20 Daytime Emmy Awards. He was 88 years old. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Margaret Chadbourn. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.